Welcome to another Sandler webinar. This is number 2 in the series. We're talking about sales management and sales leadership today. So you have watched the sales webinar that we did earlier in this week, and next week we'll be talking about organizational structure and really company executive leadership. But today is around the science of sales management and how you as a manager of salespeople can help move the needle in your organization. And so before we jump too far into it, I want to give everybody a chance to log on and you a chance to get your setup rolling. So if you haven't heard of Sandler training before, that's what we do. We train over 30,000 people a year. People are 50% more likely to hit quota than without Sandler training, and we move the needle for people, and they love it, and we're happy enough to have them refer us around the world. And our guest today is Colum Lundt. He is our CRO for our whole organization. So he manages our salespeople, but he has also done this several times and been training sales managers for years. So we'll learn more about Colum here in a second, but he is our local expert on sales management today. And one more thing you should know about Sandler is that we really try to focus on this learning process, and again, helping you move the needle, make a measurable impact in your organization. And that means you probably won't become a better sales manager by hearing Colum and I talk about it for an hour today. You're gonna have to get your hands dirty. You're gonna have to try some of this stuff. You're gonna apply it, develop those skills over time, and eventually become a master ninja sales leader. But that probably won't happen in the next 60 minutes. What we're gonna try and do is give you a ton of awareness of things that you didn't know were possible, and maybe some hidden blind spots or challenges that you run into, and as much knowledge as we can cram into 60 minutes about how to fix those problems and challenges. So that's our goal for today. We want to thank you for coming. There are a ton of sales management resources at the website, sandler.com/small business. You can get access to our app, connect with a local Sandler trainer who can help you personally, and download all of our free white papers, resources, webinars like this, and more. Just go to the website, sandler.com/small business. Some special offers for you today. So, Colum, welcome to the webinar. Our first ask of everybody is to help us shape this webinar for you. So if you can type in the chat, what are some of your biggest sales management, sales leadership challenges? What do you struggle with the most? What are you hoping that we'll solve for you here in this webinar today? Type those into the chat and we'll take a look at some of those and hopefully be able to weave some of them into the presentation. But Colum, for you, what are some of the typical ones that you see, either ones that you've personally had to overcome in your career, or ones that when you're working with sales leaders and the huge enterprise international organizations that we work with at the corporate development level, what are some of these common challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think people are nailing most of it in the chat. What I hear from frontline managers more than anything else is they don't have time to coach. So it's much about time and finding time to do the things they might know they need to do, but they're so stuck with all the busy work. I think that's number one. I think either I'm told this or I witnessed it, but many of the managers these days have a really tough time having difficult conversations with people. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's cultural, or this is everyone gets a trophy crop of managers that have gotten through the ranks and been promoted to sales, and all of a sudden they're in the role and they have a difficult time having difficult or confrontational conversations with people. So the net result of that is they tend to keep people around a lot longer than they should. So that's another one. Of course, forecasting is a perennial problem, forecast accuracy. So it rolls up, obviously. So we hear that a lot from the CROs who feel embarrassed in a board meeting or in front of an executive meeting, because they don't really have an accurate forecast, or they understand that there are major gaps in the pipeline, but they're not quite sure how to address those. Hiring problems, right? Finding great people, moving the sort of the middle, the movable middle, getting them from B to A players. So there's no, there's really nothing new under the sun. These are age-old problems. The one thing I'll say, if you really start to analyze what's driving it, Mike, is that back in the 90s, when I first became a manager, the company I was at put me through a program. They put me through a management program, and there was literally a learning track, and they had a management handbook. And so we were growing fast, but they had taken the time to put together a real program. I think these days, largely in the companies I've seen, that's absent. And so what happens is these companies tend to promote their best salespeople to become their worst managers, or they hire managers from the outside thinking, well, they have a lot of management experience and I'm going to gain that. And so what we find is that statistically, I think McKinsey had a study on this, they're the least trained role within an organization. In our own research group, I believe is either 43% of managers have never received any formalized training. So they go from this role where they're often successful to being in a role where they're, sort of OJT. And the leadership, the sort of the manager of managers, oftentimes fool themselves into thinking, well, I can just coach them along. I can teach them how to do the job. And it's often leads to real delays in their development. So those are a little bit of a list, and me opining as to the root cause of why.
And we're going to dive a lot deeper into this and look at these in 5 buckets here today. So I appreciate you chiming in the chat. A lot of these I'm seeing that you've typed in, we're going to hit on today. So you're in the right spot if you're a sales leader and you're struggling with some of these things like hiring, training, and developing salespeople, coaching instead of putting all of the emphasis on supervising and chasing and playing cops and robbers, and then mentoring. I heard a really great story today that a lot of times the culture of an organization isn't laid out anywhere. It's not taught, like you were talking about, Colum. That the culture is shown by mentorship of peers and leaders, and how you develop and control the culture of your team can be really impactful, and it's almost never addressed in any sort of formal way. So hopefully we'll dig into some of the root issues of these problems today and then give you solutions as well. And this all comes out of our Sandler Management Solutions program. So we have solutions to these problems that we've developed over the last several decades of helping thousands and tens of thousands of managers around the country come up with answers to these. So Colum, let's dive into the first one here with hiring. And I know this is one of your favorites to talk about because it really all starts there. This is, if you're the chef, this is buying the ingredients for your meal, right? It makes a big difference on the outcome on what's on that shopping list.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. So the first thing is,
challenges up here. Tell us more about these and why you think they happen.
So I think the first thing is it's a mindset or belief issue. And as you know, Mike, we look at things through that prism. When we have an issue or a challenge, it usually is either a belief issue, it's a behavior issue, or it's a technique issue. So attitudes or belief systems are in my estimation, sometimes the hardest to overcome. So I believe that they don't prioritize hiring because they're not thinking about it the right way. So one thought, and it was something that was taught to me, I can't claim to have invented this idea, but someone told me a long time ago, senior VP I worked for, said, Colum, you got to treat hiring like it's closing $1 million deal. Right? If you think about it like you're closing $1 million deal, what would you do? Well, you'd build a pipeline, right? You'd just qualify early. You would prioritize the behaviors associated with that, interviewing and so forth. And you'd get good at it. You'd practice, just like we practice and we role play in a sales cycle. It's the same for interviewing. And there's a lot of really interesting science. We can talk about that later in terms of behavioral interviewing. But be that as it may, I believe that being great at recruiting and hiring can make up for a multitude of sins. And that's been sort of the key to my success. And I think in the past is I sort of had no business running organizations, and I just was clever enough to find really smart people that knew what they were doing, that worked for me, and I got out of their way. So I think if you get good at this aspect of things, you can be wildly successful because the right people will figure out how to get things done.
And we see this a lot as a sales challenge too, right? That one of the reasons salespeople pursue bad deals is because they don't have better deals in their pipeline. And I think these causes a myriad of other issues we're going to talk about here in a minute. But if you had a line of candidates out your door that were better salespeople than the ones on your team, you wouldn't put up with a lot of BS and excuses and stuff, right? So
That's right.
It makes your whole job a lot easier. One I
That's
wanted to
right.
ask you specifically about here, oh, go ahead, was the top-heavy sales team.
I was just gonna underscore one thing you got me thinking about, Mike, and that is I can't tell you how many times I've worked with an organization where they have really poor performing people, right? And the manager says, well, it's better that I have at least someone in that territory, right? So they're not, to your point, they do not have a really solid and robust pipeline of candidates. So they hold out hope, false hope, thinking, well, at least I have someone there and some deal will happen, instead of actually getting rid of that poor performer. Obviously, you got to give them the right, help and support to try to get better. But if you reach that point where they're just not a good fit, you got to sort of release them back into the economy and hire the right person. If you do not have a good pipeline of candidates, it makes that much more difficult. So I didn't mean to interrupt you there. But
no, great point. And it really is what we're going to talk about on the solution side. It can be a science, and you can fill your pipeline and you can treat it, like you said, $1 million deal, because it is a lot of times for organizations. We see the typical cost of a bad sales hire is 5 to 10 times their annual salary or what you're expecting them to make if they're in a commission position, because you're not only losing deals, but you're losing referrals off of those deals and the lifetime value of a client that a good salesperson would bring on. So this one is an exponential problem. But one thing I wanted to highlight here for everybody is they might have this problem if they have a top-heavy sales team. And I see this a lot with organizations that when we start working with them is they have either the owner, the sales manager, or one really good salesperson that's doing 80% of the company's business. And then they have a large group of other people that are either just barely making quota, or that one person or those one or two people at the top are carrying the rest of the team. Why does that tend to happen? Why do we have high performers and then a bunch of middle and lower performers there rather than a stable team?
Yeah, part of that, I think, goes to the metrics that we look at to evaluate performance. So again, we work with larger companies, so they tend to have multiple managers. But one of the best indicators of manager effectiveness, in my estimation, is what we would call rep participation. So meaning if there are 10, let's just say a manager has 10 reps, sales reps on their team. Manager A has 10 reps, Manager B has 10 reps. Manager A is beating his or her number, Manager B isn't. We would tend to say that Manager A is a better manager. But if you look under the covers, perhaps you'll find that Manager A has 3 heavy hitters that are crushing their quota and 7 C players really, behind. Manager B has the opposite, 7 people hitting their quota, but 3 underperformers, perhaps. They're new. You would be getting a false reading. Manager B is actually probably doing a better job of managing their team because they're getting more people towards quota. So I think looking at rep participation, that metric is absolutely key. And the other thing, and we can talk about this later, is like where we spend our time. I think we tend to get sucked into spending a lot of time with the worst performers instead of figuring out how to focus on getting the movable middle to A. So if you think about sort of 20-60-20, right? 20% top performers, 60% B players, and 20% C players, we tend to get stuck spending our time with those C players instead of getting those B to A. So there's a couple ideas or observations I've seen for people to consider.
A great transition to take us into training and coaching challenges. So training, I know you work with a lot of HR and learning and development people that are trying to put programs together. We've been in the sales training business for 50 years, but I think a lot of times when people think of what we call soft skills, which are actually real skills, and human skills, which are great, but they don't really have a way to measure those or to make a movable impact on those things. And it can cause a lot of confusion in a sales manager's mind of, well, I just need to hire somebody that knows how to sell them, and then I don't have to train them. And I think that's where most people land, but why is that a kind of a false belief or promise there?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason is because even top players need coaching and training. So think about Tiger Woods, right? Still has a coach even after this many years of being professional. You see that pitching coaches and name your sport and name your top athlete, they all have coaches and trainers. Oftentimes we can't see our own blind spots. So it's really up to a good manager to take a step back and look at the overall team and the trends that he or she is seeing, and then putting an effective program in place to address it. And they don't have to have all the answers. So I'm going to opine again for a second here. There's almost this sort of, and I think this is real. I think this is something I read about this imposter syndrome. So what happens is a lot of people, they become a manager and then they're not sure how they're supposed to act. So they sort of abandon they abandon all those things that made them successful, and they start acting like a certain person, and that person is a supervisor, right? So, it's dead. I think if they kind of lean back on their problem solving capability, those tendencies or traits that made them successful in the previous role, they'll start to analyze what's going on. So we talked a little bit about the science of this. One of the ways to do that is to really look at the data. So I'm a big fan of the data, and I can talk about an analogy in a second that I think will help people when it comes to coaching. But from a training perspective, if you're mindful and you're meticulous in terms of how you run your deal reviews, you can start to see trends emerge. If you are listening in on calls, if you're listening in on your team, whether it's live as an observer, listening to a gong call or some type of recorded Zoom meeting, you get a chance to really hear what's going on. And it's important that you start to analyze those patterns and then put a training plan in place. Whether you use us, you do it yourself, you hire someone else, there are certain trends. So if I could give one bit of advice to people, would be this: go through the loss report. Really go through a loss report, not the BS that people put into the CRM in terms of why they lost deals. Oh, it's on hold, but the real reasons. Analyze the real reasons. And what you might find is, wow, 7 out of 10 times we weren't dealing with a decision maker, right? Or 5 out of 10 times we never really asked about budget until like the very end, and we were way off. So use that. Don't be afraid to learn from your losses, and then put an effective training plan in place to address those issues upstream.
I think that's great. I was just going to add here one final thought, that you are training your team every day and week, whether you have a formal training program or not. You're either training them to give you excuses and you're rewarding behavior and that they can all do their own processes, or you're training them on a company process, your decided sales process and methodology, and teaching them the culture, or you're letting them decide. But it's going to happen, right? We train people on how they can get away and with what we reward or what we punish and what we pay attention to. So I think that takes us right to coaching, because it's another one of these things where people don't have a formal process to it. But you had some great thoughts here on coaching. And I think at Sandler, we believe this is where you as the manager can do your biggest job to move the needle. So we can help you in the training. You want to fix the training problem, hire Sandler. That's real quick. You can find the money for that. But we can't really go in and coach every single person on their individual things. We train 30,000 people, right? So this is where the manager is most valuable, in my opinion. Would you agree?
I totally would agree. And I think by and large, this is where most of us fall short. Statistically, the most effective sales teams, the managers spend 40% of their time actively coaching. And I think about coaching as sort of 4 buckets, Mike. One is active coaching, and we just wrote a great book on that. Garrido's wrote a book about kind of what I used to call drive time coaching or active coaching. I think it's 21st Century Ride Along is the book. Great book on it. And of course, Bill Bartlett wrote a fantastic book on a lot of the how-to. But that's sort of that active coaching, listening on calls is so valuable. And back in the old days, we used to have splitters on the phone. So we worked in a company that would sell over the phone and then go meet the client. So sort of a hybrid role. But as managers, we would spend an hour with this person, then slide our chair over and then listen on this call. And so this is an issue for most people for 2 reasons. And it used to be because they spent more time supervising, less time. I think it's number one, they don't prioritize the time it takes to coach. They don't prioritize those coaching moments. And 2, they're not good at it. And you're looking at the guiltiest person. My tendency is to want to solve the problem. So it's to tell versus teach. Like, well, just say this, or next time you should say that. But if you really study what coaching is all about, it's really Socratic. Similar to sales. Right? So we always say you can never convince a prospect to buy. They have to convince themselves. Well, it's the same thing with a rep. They have to arrive at the conclusion themselves. So this is much more of a Socratic approach. So you have this sort of prioritized active coaching, we'll call it. You have ad hoc coaching. Someone comes up and says, hey, Mike, what do you think I should do in this situation, right? And you want to immediately jump in and maybe you're running around. You have deal debriefing. I believe huge missed opportunity. Number one, chance to coach. And it's because it's not just you coaching, it's all the other people on the team who have a lot of great insight and have seen this before. So that's the third. And then there's one-on-one. And a biggest mistake in a one-on-one, and again, you're talking to someone who's totally guilty about it, is you start to go down the rabbit hole on a deal. Like, hey, by the way, what happened on XYZ deal? And so now your one-on-one gets spent talking about a deal instead of coaching them to the behaviors and activities, helping them clear roadblocks, which is really what you should be doing in a one-on-one. So I think there's at least four opportunities to coach that I see. We're missing it big time because we don't prioritize it, or we don't know how to sort of turn it back around to them so they start to solve the problem.
Yeah, you nailed it on that one, and that'll take us to mentoring. But to put a bow on the coaching challenges, I think if you see yourself shoulding on people when you're saying you should do this, I don't understand why people don't just go do this, and especially on those individual deals like you mentioned. I think you're not coaching, you're telling there. And the other one there is people try and do this in bulk, or they don't set private things. So they'll say, hey, run a deal for me and let's role play in the sales meeting. Well, that puts the other person on the spot, and they're not going to open up and tell you their real emotional reasons for not making that cold call in front of all of their peers and stuff. You're just not going to get to the real issues that way. And finally, I think that goes to what a really good coaching call is, and that's understanding the motivations of your people and taking the time to really go deep with good questions rather than just, hey, did you sell anything this week, Colum? That's how most salespeople start their one-on-ones, right? And that goes to this mentoring. If you don't really understand why they're there, what they're doing, what their personal struggles with, and what their personal strengths are, and how to leverage those, you can't really manage anybody effectively, in my opinion. So that goes to mentoring challenges. Tell us about these.
Now, Mike, I'm gonna push back on you a little bit. If you can go back to the previous slide. So you said 2 things. One, I agree wholeheartedly with. The last thing you said is about diving deep, and sometimes that requires you to prepare, right? So you can be effective. But where I would push back is I think it's actually okay to ask someone to role play in front of their peers So for example, let's say you ask the rep, use in front, on the deal, on a particular deal, they put it up and you're talking about it. And you say, hey, Mike, what's the firm future commitment? What's the next step? Time, date, and agenda. And they're like, oh, I didn't get one. Okay, now we all know you should get one because otherwise you're playing phone tag, and it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, as we all know, right? You're in the prospect system. So they say, I didn't get one. And you say, how come? We don't want to use the word why, right? Because why is a bit more
challenging.
Critical parent, putting them on the defensive. So we might say, how come? And they say, well, so I might say, well, what did it sound like when you asked this, the chief revenue officer for one? I'd almost like you to role play it with me in front of the team, because that's where the rubber meets the road. I think that's where people get a chance to actually practice and hear each other. And it's okay to put I think it's okay to put a little pressure on. You're not trying to pull the pants down in front of everyone in the meeting, but right. I do believe that it's okay to put a little bit of pressure on, because we're trying to get better. And I think you only get better, you only learn if you start to stretch outside your comfort zone a little bit. So that's the only thing I would say based on that one. So
well, I agree with that for sure. And you do really great role play sessions with our team where that's the upfront contract. We're all going to role play together and we're going to get on here and do this. I think where I see sales managers struggle is they try to coach everybody in the sales meeting, and that's not really the time for coaching. That's time for meeting. Now you can have other meetings where you do that, but I think it's tough. So, I mean, this takes us to mentoring. So how is this different? And there's so many roles and so many things we're asked to do. We got 2 left here for the sales manager. This job is not easy, right?
I agree. And this is the one I sort of struggle to describe a little bit. The way I think about it, Mike, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I think about this is a little bit of life coaching, a little bit of career counseling. Mm-hmm. And personally, I encourage folks to find someone else besides me. That it doesn't need to be me as their. So you are going to provide a little bit of this role, but I think it's okay. I really do believe that sometimes it's enough for you to just encourage your people to go get a mentor and say, you may want to reach out to so-and-so and have them be an accountability partner, have them mentor you, because it's another set of eyes and ears that doesn't necessarily have a direct reporting relationship, so they really have no dog in the hunt, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's great. Same thing can be said for coaching too. It's great to have a coach outside yourself, and the more coaches, the better, in my opinion, because then you get more people, almost like a board of directors, helping you choose your strategies. And mentors are the same way. You can have peer mentors. You can be mentoring down. You can be mentoring up, and all kinds of cool things here. I think for me, the challenge here is really taking the time to be personal about what their career path and their aspirations are, and helping, like you said, career path, something that they feel motivated. People don't leave jobs typically because of pay or the situations. They leave because their manager or they don't have upward mobility and they don't know where they're going with stuff. So I think, the lack of mentoring might not be a big challenging at the first year somebody's with you, but 10 years in or 5 years in, how do you keep them going all the time if you're not having these regular coaching and mentoring sessions? Heard a great story today of somebody that used to work for David Sandler back in the 90s, that he would be on them all of the time. What's in their pipeline? Who are they calling? In the office, would just be grilling them. Let me see your board. What's in your pipeline on your board? What's this deal? What's that about? What's their next step? What's their problem? Where are they stuck? Just hammering them with questions. But then he would take them out to lunch, and it would be hammering them on their personal life and nothing about work. If you asked a question about a deal, he would flip it and change the subject back to what's going on in your life? How's the family? How are your kids? And making sure that that person is taken care of as well as the deals, right? Because it's really easy to burn out with rejection in sales and other kinds of things that if we don't keep an eye on can crop up and cause major issues or turnover, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it's a matter of prioritizing and setting that time aside, which is the first bullet point. But do you think, Mike, it's also about taking the time up front to understand a person's intrinsic motivation. So
Yeah.
oftentimes I'll ask a manager, so how many of your people do you have their business plan, their personal plan for the year? And very few of them. And I'll ask, have you shared yours with them? And sometimes I think it's, unless you really take the time to get those from them and really understand what they're motivated by and what their long-term career aspirations are, it's hard to even know where to mentor.
I was thinking that too with we talked about role playing, but role modeling and sharing your accountability structure and stuff with people of saying, hey, I'm doing my calls too. Here's my regular behavior that I'm doing. I asked you to do these things. Here's what I'm working on so that I can help make the team better and remove these roadblocks for you. There's a lot we can unpack, and we'll circle back to that one because we got one more here to talk about the challenges, and then we're going to flip to solutions. So supervising, I feel like, is the dumping ground where everything goes if you messed up one of the first four. So if you hired bad, you didn't train them, you didn't coach or mentor, now you have this cops and robbers thing where you're going to have to be a micromanager, and you're going to have to look for accountability situations and really hammer those numbers and stuff because you messed up on the first four. But obviously, in any manager's role, there's a certain level of reporting, funnel management, and things that happen here. So how do you see supervising?
Well, I would ask a question to you, and that is, do you think people feel more or less comfortable holding someone accountable if they are doing the behaviors themselves?
Oh, definitely more comfortable. Yeah.
So like, I see that with my kids or even with my team. But if I feel like, hey, I'm doing this, and this, like, I have every reason and every right to hold you accountable, right? Everyone's got to do their job. That's the one NFL coach in New England says. Everyone's got to do their job. And so I do believe that building a culture of accountability is absolutely critical. You definitely, I forget what the saying is, but you sort of, you get what you tolerate type of thing. And so if you let people get away with it, then they think it's okay. And it's just that culture of acceptance instead of holding people's feet to the fire. But I think it really is, there's two things for me. One is, I don't want to hold someone to do something. I don't want to feel like a hypocrite. So I never want to hold someone accountable to do something I wouldn't do myself or I'm not doing myself. The second is that I think people have a hard time knowing what to really hammer people on. They do it on the results, not the behaviors. And I think, and I always think about, like, what's 100% in control of the rep, right? So it's calls and emails and in-mails and asking for referrals, right? All those things are 100% in their control. So they can't control where they get a referral, for example, but they can certainly control where they ask for them. So are we laying out very clearly the formula, the recipe, the cookbook for success in our organization? So, hey, you come on my team, this is what's expected of you. These are the minimum committed behaviors. Is that being laid out very clearly and enunciated clearly up front? And then are they holding them accountable to those behaviors? And so that's kind of the one-on-one. For me, it's sort of like, hey, you said you're going to do it this. How did that go? Here's what I said I would do for you this week. Like, hold me accountable. So I think it's I think it usually boils down to a few of those things. Either it's not clear, they feel sort of squeamish about holding people accountable. There's this I think we call it the manager myths. Hamish Knox wrote about that, where you have this sort of real concern that you might be labeled a micromanager, so you don't hold them accountable to anything, or you just kind of fall back on, telling them, hey, you got to do this, you got to do that, where's this, where's that, without actually providing any of the other three things we just talked about: the coaching and the mentoring and the training. So there's a few things to unpack on this, but definitely a challenge. This of the four is the only one that comes from an authoritative relationship, I should say. The other three are based on kind of a personal relationship. This one, like, you can hire and fire people if they're not living up to this. So you got to be very smart about how you utilize your role as supervisor.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And so while people are typing in here, I want you to say now, out of those 5 that we just covered, hiring was the other one. So hiring, training, coaching, mentoring, and supervising. Which of those creates the biggest challenge for you that if you solved it would make the biggest impact on your organization and your career this year? So right now, as we sit here on this webinar, which one of those for you that if you solved it and really got good at it, you became a master at it, would be the biggest impact for you? And Colum, I was thinking about the supervising, that's a real balance. And I think that's one that you're a master at. It might be your military background or others, and we can unpack it more here when we circle back around to it. But do you feel like that was a hard lesson learned, or that really the measurement and using data and things helps you make better decisions, that it just became a priority for you?
That's a good question. I started at a company that was so focused on behavior. So they had dialed in a formula, and they could tell you what. So when I sat down, it's like, all right, kid, here's you want to work here. Here's how it goes. We work from 7 to 6:30 on Mondays and Tuesdays, 7 to 5:30 on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and 8 to 4:30 on Fridays. It's a minimum of 60 dials a day outbound, and you need to add 2 new contacts where you've had a meaningful conversation that you would explain what a meaningful conversation was. And so, and they said, if you do those things, if you work the hours, by the way, they role play 3 times a week, which is why I'm so big on that. But it's, if you do that and you add these 2, you have 2 really meaningful conversations with 2 potential buyers every week. This is how many opportunities it will yield, and they had every ratio dialed in. So as a company, now you fast forward, you have hundreds and hundreds of salespeople. They could literally tell you, Mike, if every one of our people just makes 1 more dial a day, or 1 more email a day, 1 more activity a day, right? That's 5 a week. That adds $1.9 million to the revenue. Like, and they could tell you. And so they were very clear, and they were unambiguous, and they said, look, if you want to work here, this is what you have to do, and this is what you'll make. And
Yeah.
they were right. They had dialed it in. So I'm a big believer in those types of behaviors, whatever that formula is. Now, again, it doesn't have to be so prescriptive that you say, oh, it's 60 calls. It could be 40 total activities. It could be 30 activities. It could be 10. Those activities could be in-mail messages or whatever. But there's got to be some recipe, and I think it's up to the managers to really figure out what that formula is, so that at the end of the day, as a rep, you could go home, you haven't sold a blessed thing, you haven't even pipelined anything, but you had a hell of a day. You could walk out proud of a good day's work for a good day's pay, and you did all those behaviors that will lead to those great results.
Well, and it solves a lot of challenges for me. I think, measuring, salespeople don't know what a good day is if they didn't sell something, right? And managers don't know what reps are doing well and which ones aren't if they didn't have any business come in today. And so I think so many of us look at lagging indicators that when you really get really good at measuring, and I know we're going to talk about these in a second, so we need to move on and do these in order before we spill all over candy. But you use tools like Gong and stuff to measure what people are saying. So you could actually be predicting future sales based on what your people are saying on the phone today if you get really good at the supervising and measuring part. So we'll come back to that. But I wanted to ask everybody else here before we moved off this slide is to think about that challenge and see if you could put a dollar number to that, either for yourself or for the organization. If you solve that problem, what would the dollar amount be? Is that a $10,000 problem? Is it a $100,000 problem or a $10 million problem? I think a lot of times we get so busy working in our business that we forget to stop back and look and go, oh wait, if I just stopped and solved this one thing, that could be another $10 million in revenue for us. Maybe we should pay some attention to that, even if we don't have time today. And hiring, I think, is the first one. So it takes us right in here. If you get hiring wrong, this could be costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you get it right, it could be making you hundreds of thousands of dollars. So tell us about the Sandler hiring process and best practices here. If we were going to start fresh, we got a brand new company, we're going to get hiring right. What are some things we need to look
I think what you'd want to do is first benchmark the characteristics or traits and competencies of the top sales performers. And, Mike, I look at it like skills and experience are above the waterline. Traits and competencies and characteristics are below. And oftentimes we look for skills and experience, right? I need someone with 5 years of enterprise sales and SaaS experience and this and that. And I think I learned a very important lesson at one point where this company I mentioned, we grew from probably 7 million when I got there, and we were 155 million when I left 5 years later, all organic growth. And one of the things that they got right was dialing in on the hiring profile, and we looked for people who embodied those traits and did not necessarily the skills. What it did is open up the aperture. So now instead of looking for someone with 5 years of this and 2 years of manufacturing experience and XYZ, now we said, hey, our top performers all are extremely goal-oriented. They can deal with frustration. They're professionally humble, right? They're intellectually curious. They're scrappy. Whatever the case is, you come up with those, and then you start to look for people who have that. And maybe you go to your team and say, hey, look, it's tough times out there right now, but like tomorrow, if this thing could change and all of a sudden we're scrambling to find good people. And I think we're going to see that very quickly. I know just anecdotally in the last few days, a bunch of people who got offers. But if you start with that, it's just like I said earlier, you would build a kind of an ideal client profile, desired client profile. You do the same thing for candidates. So really, what does that look like? You go to your team and say, hey, I'm looking for someone like this. Don't worry about the skills and experience. Who do you know that can deal with frustration, that's goal-oriented, et cetera, et cetera? And all of a sudden, you start to see more candidates than you would have before, because now you're focusing on the core traits. So that's number one. Developing a hiring process is extremely important. Oftentimes, one of the biggest issues is people aren't aligned internally on what we're looking for. So you can waste an awful lot of time bringing candidates in only for your boss or someone else to say, and they're looking at the person through a completely different lens. You're not all on the same page. So that's a big thing. And that's where that search criteria comes in. So if you can kind of outline, what are the skills and experience and attributes and, habits, et cetera, you're looking for, you can evaluate someone with a common lens. So there's the process and the search alignment. There's phone screening, especially if you're going to hire someone who's going to sell over the phone. Wouldn't you want to basically be assessing two things at the same time, assessing the answers to your questions and assessing their phone skills? So all of that plays a role. We used to bounce people. We had a lot of professionals that we hired, architects and project and program managers in a company I work for. And we literally used to be able to get someone a direct flight in. And we used to say, no, make sure they have to get a layover. And when we booked the flight. And the reason why was because we'd let them sit in the front, while they were sitting in the front, the lady at the front desk would talk to these candidates. And before I interviewed them, I'd come out and ask, so what did they say? And she'd always ask them this question. She was trained to ask this question as part of our process, which was, how was your travel? And if they started to moan about, woe is me, I got stuck here, I got stuck there, like, we didn't want them. So we quickly found out that people are like, it is what it is, typical travel stuff. Those are people I was interested in because they were going to have to do that for their jobs, and I don't want a bunch of complainers. So that hiring process, including making sure everyone's aligned, is critical. Interviewing, behavioral interviewing is a science. I would recommend you get really good at it. And good news is a lot of the Sandler skills apply.
If people haven't heard of the word behavioral interviewing before, tell us about that really quick.
Sure. So many books on the subject, but it's true. We use a different part of our brain to recall information than we do to create it. So the best way to understand how someone's going to perform is how they did it in the past. So you would ask a ton of questions and you interrupt that person all along the way so they can't lie or dissemble or give you some BS answer. And salespeople are great at selling themselves. So this is a very important element. You have to get really good at behavioral interviewing, and you have to interrupt them constantly, unabashedly, so you can get the true answer. And there's things we're listening for, the royal we versus I. I mean, there's a ton of stuff. This is a whole business science, and we have a really good approach. So that's one element. The other element which you have is assessing, and sometimes, trusting your gut is not always the right answer. You should let some of these tools help guide you and sniff out weakness. The other thing is having a diverse team of interviewers, I find, is really helpful because different people pick up on different vibes that you may not. So part of that assessment is having multiple people that are selected because of their interview skills and because they represent a bit of a diverse background, and then coupling that with a tool like an Outmatch. DISC is important, I think, as well, because it helps you understand their personality. So if you're, let's say, high D, and you have a really tough time like managing, C style, you may want to know that. But I think the Outmatch can help you uncover some of those underlying traits I talked about earlier.
Oh, absolutely. I was definitely going to highlight the Outmatch and extended disc profiles that we do. Outmatch also has a video interviewing platform, so you can send them the questions, have them record the video answers, and then multiple people can review and evaluate those answers, and you can share them internally. That's kind of interesting, and I think adds a science to it where, like you said, I think there's two problems here. One, people hire people like themselves. So I kind of think about when you have a kid, you kind of wish that your kid is basically a mini version of you. They're going to like all the same things. They're going to want to hang out with you, watch the same TV shows, be just like you, and you'll have this best friend that's your clone. And I think that's what sales managers do. Well, I sell this way, and so I have a sense of urgency, and I want hard closers. And so you hire all these people that are just like you, but then you don't build a very balanced team, or there might not be the best way to sell in this environment. You might have customers that prefer a more nurturing and farming approach, or that's the business that you're in. And so I think definitely getting those independent reviews and assessments. The other thing is we kind of skipped over the recruiting, but we work with ZipRecruiter and their training and stuff too, that having a pool of candidates is like having a full pipeline. You can then disqualify bad candidates rather than trying to pick that one good one or your best option out of 5 poor candidates. Right, so having a big pool makes this so much easier.
I agree. Yeah, Indeed has a great tool, and ZipRecruiter. LinkedIn has a job offering. So yeah, there's a lot of tools out there that can help you sort of. But again, that there's a whole sort of art to building the job description that's attractive to people as well. So there's a lot to sort of casting that wide net.
And I love what you said about making salespeople sell, right? I know you do that a lot too. They're going to hear no. So if you tell them yes on the job, that doesn't make it very easy. Let's hear what happens when we say no, or that it's over. They can continue to pursue. Make them follow up, right? If you need salespeople that follow up in your business, might make sense to have them do that and jump through a couple of hoops during the interview. But let's transition to training. So now we have somebody. Onboarding seems to be a big hole. There used to be like you said, 2-week onboarding trainings where you would go to the home office and fly in, and you'd learn product knowledge and all kinds of stuff. A lot of that has gone away, but also I think that, again, people are trying to hire people that already know how to sell so they don't train. There is a science to this as well, and I know you and I both geek out on L&D best practices. Can you talk a little bit about how we help people develop a good training program that actually gets measurable results?
Yes. So there's a gentleman called Larry D'Angelo who I think he beat the numbers 39 quarters in a row at Logman, beat the street. He as and his organization spent a lot of time on onboarding, and they had some very sharp people. And one woman explained the data to me about how if you do a great job of onboarding, the reps tend to stay in the company longer and perform faster. So, the best metric I've seen is looking at time to second deal. As you know, there's sort of a few things, right? Time to second deal, because you can get a first, an easy one, lucky one first. So time to second deal is a great metric to look at. Time to full ramp, and you know, obviously, if you're on target for your quota. Some people look at time to competency, and there's a few metrics. But point is, again, it goes back to how do you look at onboarding? Now, the way these guys did was they looked at it like this is the person's first impression of the company, and if their onboarding process is really rocky and they're trying to get their laptop for days on end, and the training is really spotty, they don't necessarily have that great of an impression. But if it's really buttoned down and there's a competency that's demonstrated by the firm right off the bat, the person's like, okay, I better raise my game. This is legit. So now you get that, you kind of pull that, they rise to that level, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, if you equip them the right way and if you train them properly, it expedites the time to their productivity, right? The time to first deal, time to second deal. And guess what happens? They start to feel good. They're like, wow, I can be successful here. And so now that breeds, that feeds on itself, I should say. And they're in that company for a lot longer, and then you don't have that sort of turnover and attrition. You've productive people faster. So I think onboarding is a huge missed opportunity for a lot of companies. This is a little bit of self-promotion here at Sandler, but Larry made Sandler the first 2 days of training. They bring people from around the world to Boston, and the first 2 days of the onboarding training that they got were Sandler. So, and then they would add kind of product knowledge on top of that, and then they'd weave them together. So by the end of the week, they were role playing about specific products, and it was excellent. So they really did put a lot of time and effort. And so I think this is a huge opportunity. Of course, training is not just onboarding, right? It's enablement going forward. So question for the folks out there is, what are you doing to continue to provide training and enablement, especially if you hire people that are about continuous improvement?
I think you nailed it. Those were my 2 thoughts. One is that impact training, that first hit is the common language and the culture part that you highlighted there. Is it's really hard to manage people if everybody's doing their own thing. So you have to establish this common language and common sales process and methodology for your team. Otherwise, if you have 5 team members, you got 5 different ways of selling to keep track of, and 5 different ways that they qualify and do their forecasting and their deals, or how they go about selling. It's a mess and makes your job 5 times harder. And the second thing you mentioned there at the end is reinforcement. We know that you can't just take somebody and fix them. Oh, put them through the 2-week onboarding, they're fixed, they're going to sell perfectly for the next 50 years. Crank up that wind up on the back of the car and let them go. They're good. It takes accountability, reinforcement, repetition, and especially if you're doing something new in training, you have to let them know that this isn't a flavor of the week. This is a change, and there's a change process to that. So if you're a new manager or you're establishing a new process, I think that takes us to the coaching discussion here, but you're going to have to repeat, remind, and reinforce that over and over again till people really see that as the new culture, right?
Yeah, culture and change are the 2 key words, Mike. You're spot on. It's a culture of learning. You have to embed a culture of learning. So training is sort of like what happens to them in a way, right? But they have to process it and learn. And sometimes that training doesn't even need to be you. You can have your folks do teach backs, or you highlight, a bright spot. Someone did something great. Have them talk to the team about it. They get a little bump, right? A little bit of limelight, but they also have the opportunity to share best practice with the team. So it doesn't just need to be you. So you're right. You're absolutely right.
Let's talk about coaching here. Now, these are private one-on-one discussions where we're helping them remove a roadblock in their obstacles of what's keeping them from successful. And the way I think about it is everybody brings their own head trash, their own baggage to the party, right? So I used to be on the radio. I love to be funny and entertaining. Need for approval is clearly my thing. I want to be liked more than I want the sales sometimes. And that hurts. And it's really hard for me to get over. Now, the person right next to me might be doing the same dials, same behaviors and everything, but they have a completely different problem. They were poor growing up. And so they have trouble asking for money, or the stuff that we sell are tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it sounds like monopoly money to them. And so how do we as sales managers figure out those performance codes of each person on our team?
Very good question. I mean, you can't dial in on that unless you're observing it and studying it. So it starts with that assessment. So I'm going to give you an example of how I think about it. And I assume that most of the managers have very limited time to actually devote to coaching. So the question is, like, what do you coach on specifically? Mm-hmm. And so to your point, it's the individual, but it's also the team. And this is where the data can come in. In the 1970s, I think New York, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I believe New York City had like between 3,500 and 4,000 murders every year, right? And then I want to say it was Bill Bratton came in, chief of police, and implemented this thing called comp staff, which is basically they get all the precinct commanders together and they would analyze data, and they would look at, hey, where are the increase of calls from citizens and increase in calls from other police for broken windows, for graffiti, for robbery, for all these things, right? And they'd say, oh, wow, this particular neighborhood last week or last 2 weeks seems to have a lot more of your fair share of these little crimes. And so let's increase the number of patrols. And so what would happen is the crime went down because they were able to take limited resources and apply them based on data to the right areas of town. So, and I think the numbers bore that out. They were down like 500 murders. It's still terrible, but you get the point. So I think the same can be, it's an analogy that we can use, right? So with limited time, limited resources, where are we going to patrol? Right? Where are we going to patrol as managers? Where are we going to coach to? And I think this is where the data comes in. We have to be looking at the right measurements of sort of, inputs. What we say here is we use the acronym AIR, activities, indicators, and results. How are we looking at those metrics to know where to coach and how to coach? And then to your point, it's like, okay, this shows me there's an issue with this person. They're constantly, the last 3 weeks, the number of meetings set to meetings kept has dropped. Let's just use that as an example. Okay, so a quality metric. What's going on there? It's the signal for me to kind of dive in and delve in and ask a lot of questions. And then Sandler has an awesome way to evaluate the root cause, and that is the success triangle: behavior, attitude, technique. So this person's struggling. What's going on here? Is this a behavior problem? Is it a attitude, head trash type problem, or is it a technique problem? But I don't know where to go unless I look at that data first, and then I kind of go over there, patrol over there, and then I investigate. And then I look at it through that lens that we teach people, and now you know what to do for each of those. If it's a behavior problem, we can help managers fix that. If it's a technique problem, of course, we got great stuff. And if it's a belief or attitude problem, we have a lot on that. So to me, that's what it's about. It's about identifying where to focus with your limited time, focusing there, and then really being like a bulldog in terms of uncovering what the real issue is. And sometimes or more often than not, it's actually, a mindset issue.
Yeah, and we're running a little short on time, so I think we've covered mentoring pretty well. And you mentioned we have great resources on this, like Antonio Garrido's book, The 21st Century Ride Along. I think the ride along and the virtual ride along, even in this environment this summer, is extremely powerful of showing up with your team and being a part of the team as a mentor. But were there any takeaways from that book or others here for role modeling, mentoring, ride-alongs that you think sales leaders mess up that they need to be better at?
The number one thing I would say is make it a priority.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, just think about what would we say to our reps, right? We'd say, hey, make prospecting a priority. Carve out a block to make calls and emails and emails. Like just block out that activity. Shove your phone in the drawer. Your cell phone, your personal phone, I should say, and focus on this for a couple. It's the same type of thing. I think that there's so much in that book that people can draw from, but you can't get any benefit if you're not doing it.
Yeah, and I think I would just second that self-esteem development on the slide too, that we talked about it earlier, but people can get beat up and we all have these ups and downs, and especially this year, holy cow, could we have had more stress and volatility for members of your team that if you're not watching who they are and their self-esteem and how they feel, it's going to affect their performance. And so it's great to do that coaching and dive in and develop their sales skills. Obviously, we should all be doing that, but I think also most people just don't take the time to listen, figure out how they're feeling, what headspace they're in. If they're worried about their sick grandmother in the hospital, they're probably not focused on that next cold call. And so we got to understand where they are and help put them back together so that they can keep going longer and longer. But I did want to hit some of your favorite tools here in supervising before we wrap up, and we have just a couple of minutes. Analytics and reporting and monitoring those KPIs, forecasting, all of this is really tricky stuff, especially for small businesses that don't have some of these tools. But could you talk about a few of your favorites and the important leading indicators that you measure and large companies that are really good at this measure?
Sure. I guess first thing is aligning it with your sales stages or your sales cycle. So sort of what are the entry and exit criteria from each stage? So what would you want to have accomplished before you move to the next stage? And part of this is a philosophy, right? I personally believe that deals are promoted through a pipeline, and that means they have to earn a promotion. So, and you can't be afraid to tell someone to bump it back if they don't have the requisite information. So when you lay out your pipeline, your stages, you would really figure out what do you need to pull out in that stage. What do you want the salespeople to pull out? And you can't do it all at once, right? Can't it be all? But certainly you're going to have some criteria before you present, right? That's Sandler sort of 101. Before you show and tell, before you give someone the harbor tour, you need to make sure you get a handful of pieces of information around pain, investment, or budget, decision-making process, right? You need to understand all that. So it may not happen at once. You may have multiple calls before you do that, but there's other information that you would get after that. So before a deal is closed, you want to lay out and plot what information you need at what phase, and where are you going to draw the line in terms of what's acceptable before you promote it. So that's number one. I assign a weighting at the end of that stage. So you go through and you can go tick through these things. It's earned 40%, and you can move to the next stage. So big thing I think about, Mike, is there's some quality metrics and quantity metrics. I think a lot of people look at the quantity. I've actually spent time with very successful companies that are experts at data themselves, but when I really interviewed people and asked, hey, how are you measuring your salespeople? They sort of came back to the same two things: pipeline and revenue. Pipeline and revenue. I mean, they're missing a whole section of metrics early on. So I think those are the and you don't have to boil the ocean. It doesn't need to be a ton. It needs to probably be a couple things, and one of those should be conversion from one stage to the next. Conversion from one stage to the next. So that gives you a little bit of the quality perspective. And again, what are we using these KPIs for? So we can coach, so we can dive in, we can control that area. You mentioned playbook. Awesome. I mean, why wouldn't you have a playbook? It's replicating what your best reps do so you can get everyone doing it. and you constantly change that, right? I'll give you a quick 1 minute story. So, talked to a manager. Most of the managers, they had like 100 SDRs, and many of the managers had a 70% conversion ratio meeting set to meetings kept, meaning 30% of the time, these expensive resources were sitting on the phone, kind of twiddling their thumbs, and no one was there. This one manager, he had a way higher ratio, and I won't get into all the details because we got to leave something for paid customers. But he had like a 90-something% conversion ratio. And I asked him, I said, why is that? And his people they'd come up with a super clever technique, right? And so I came back from those interviews and I'm like, why aren't all the other managers replicating that? And I don't think he was trying to keep that close hold. I just think he was just focused on his team and so forth. But if I was the leader and had a playbook, I would be looking at the data saying, hey, Mike, what are you doing differently? Oh, I love that technique. I love the best practice. It could be a Sandler thing. It could be something that someone came up with on their own. I would take that, bake that into the playbook. Now, all my new people, everyone who's going through the sales cycle could benefit from that. So I think that's huge. So I think we nailed most of it. From what I said, pipeline management.
I just add to that too, that with today's modern technology, measuring these don't have to be admin burden. It doesn't have to be your salespeople typing all this into the LMS. So we work with Gong to do voice analytics and call recording, where I know I've heard you talk about clients that have salespeople talking more than they're listening, have lower closing percentages than the ones that were listening more on second appointments and stuff. So it's really interesting where you say, oh, okay, if we can just teach our people better questions and get them to listen more, we can move the needle. We can tell that it raises our sales. We also saw the same thing with the Sandler tool of upfront contracts. A client was measuring all of their calls across a large enterprise organization, and the salespeople that were using upfront contracts were doing more deals than the ones that were not. And it was all based on the voice analytics and monitoring what they were saying. That stuff to me is the science of modern sales management. And what makes this really exciting is that it doesn't have to be wishy-washy, soft skills, hope and pray. Oh, I think this guy is going to be able to sell because I like him and he's a real go-getter. No, we can measure. He's saying this on this call that made this percentage difference in his ability to hit quota. That's huge.
Absolutely. And you don't even need to, technology just expedites and helps it. But if you're listening on all these calls as a manager, you see the pattern and you're like, okay, this person, she's using an upfront contract every time. And I notice that she's got greater velocity in her pipeline than anyone else. I want all of you to pay attention. I want you to focus on this. Let's practice it as a team. Let's role play it. Maybe you have her up to talk about how she does it. So it's using your good sense stemming from listening and observing.
I love that. So obviously here at Sandler, these are the type of management problems that we solve, and we have solutions already built for, ready to help you and your sales management team. If you need help on hiring, training, coaching, mentoring, or supervising, contact us, and I'll give you the link here in 1 second. But again, I want to ask you, which of these processes needs the most attention from you? Which would make the biggest difference? What would move the needle for you so that you have greater revenue and more to invest in? We expect an ROI by fixing these problems. So if it's not hurting you or it's not costing you any sales, congratulations, pick something else. And if you want to learn more about Sandler and how we do these things, Colum is our CRO who leads our corporate development team that helps multi-state, multinational organizations with thousands of salespeople around the world. But we also have local trainers in over 250 locations and I think over 25 countries, where you can work with a local office one-on-one as a small business. So go to sandler.com/small business to learn more, find a local trainer, or get any of our free resources to help you solve these problems and figure them out for yourself. Colum, any final thoughts?
No, I appreciate that. If you have, I'd say if you have more than 10 managers, if you have more than 150 salespeople, we'd definitely be interested in talking if it's these are areas you need help with and you feel it might move the needle. Management is a particular issue, not an issue, but a passion of mine, because it's a one-to-many ratio. And so certainly feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And if it's not the right fit, we'll get you in the right hands. But definitely appreciate, Mike, you taking the time to put this together.
And I would second that on the other side. If you're an individual sales manager and your company won't invest in you and your career, you can work with one of our local offices and invest in yourself. And we found great ROI on that, because this is stuff you get to use for the rest of your life. So we fixed this hiring problem once. You get to keep using that knowledge and training that we provide for you over and over again throughout your career. So check out that link, sandler.com/small business. Thank you for listening. And next week, we have the organizational excellence for talking about the blind spots of organizational leaders, so not just sales leaders, but the CEOs, the owners, and presidents that are having to shape the whole company's direction. We'll be talking about that in our next webinar. Good luck, good selling.
Thank you.